The moment that changed everything didn't feel dramatic. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no scene you'd remember years later as the worst day of your life. It was quiet. I had made one wrong choice, the kind kids make all the time, and I expected consequences. I expected disappointment, maybe even anger. What I didn't expect was how quickly our relationship would shift. The spanking itself was brief, controlled, almost procedural. It ended faster than my thoughts could catch up. But what came after stayed. My father didn't yell. He didn't lecture. He didn't explain. He simply went quiet. And in that silence, something between us changed, something I wouldn't understand until much later. I was still young enough to believe mistakes could be fixed with honesty, old enough to know rules existed for a reason, but young enough to think intentions mattered. The wrong choice I made wasn't dangerous, it wasn't criminal, it wasn't even rebellious in the way adults imagine rebellion. It was careless. I chose convenience over responsibility. I ignored something I was supposed to do, thinking I could deal with it later. I told myself it wouldn't matter, that no one would notice. But my father noticed. He always did. When he found out, he didn't react the way I expected. There was no raised voice, no explosion of anger. He listened briefly, nodded once, and told me to stand up. His face wasn't angry, it was closed. That scared me more. The punishment happened quickly and ended just as quickly. There was no explanation attached to it, no lesson spelled out, no "this is why." He walked away afterward like the matter was settled. But it wasn't. I stood there alone, unsure what I was supposed to feel. The room felt different, quieter, like something invisible had been removed. Later that evening, I realized what it was. Him. My father was still physically present in the house, but emotionally he was gone. At dinner, he spoke to everyone else. He asked my siblings questions. He joked lightly with my mother. When I spoke, the conversation moved on as if I hadn't. It wasn't obvious enough for anyone else to notice, but it was obvious enough for me to feel. I ate quietly, my appetite gone. Not because of the punishment, but because of the space that had suddenly opened between us. Children notice distance the way adults notice silence in an empty room. It doesn't have to be loud to be uncomfortable. That night, I lay in bed replaying everything. The wrong choice, the punishment, the quiet afterward. I wasn't thinking about what I had done wrong anymore. I was thinking about what I had lost. The next morning, my father spoke to me again, but only in instructions. Get ready. Don't be late. Eat your breakfast. His tone was neutral, controlled, polite. And that somehow hurt more than anger ever could have, because anger still acknowledges you. Silence makes you invisible. Over the next few days, I tried to fix things the only way I knew how. I behaved perfectly. I did everything asked of me without complaint. I stayed out of the way. I made myself useful. I waited for some sign that things were back to normal. But normal didn't come back the way I expected. My father wasn't cruel. He wasn't harsh. He simply kept a distance. And I learned something quietly during that time. The punishment had ended. The consequence hadn't. I began watching him closely, studying his mood, trying to predict what version of him I'd get that day. I adjusted myself around that uncertainty. If he seemed distant, I stayed quiet. If he seemed neutral, I didn't push. If he seemed relaxed, I still held back, just in case. That wrong choice taught me something I didn't realize I was learning. That mistakes don't just bring consequences, they change relationships. And that idea settled deep inside me. Before that moment, I believed my relationship with my father was stable, that rules existed, but love stayed underneath them. After that moment, love felt conditional, not because he said it was, but because it felt like it could be taken away. I stopped talking freely around him. I stopped sharing small things. I stopped asking questions that might annoy him. I wasn't trying to be manipulative. I was trying to be safe. No one explained to me when the distance would end. No one told me what I was supposed to learn. No one said, "We're okay now." So I filled in the blanks myself. I decided that being careful was better than being honest, that being quiet was safer than being open, that avoiding mistakes mattered more than understanding them. That's how one wrong choice stopped being about behavior. It became about connection. Weeks later, my father returned to what most people would call normal. He spoke more, he joked occasionally, he acted like the matter was behind us. But something in me didn't reset. I didn't trust calm anymore, because calm had once turned into distance, and distance had taught me that relationships could change without warning. That lesson didn't come from the spanking, it came from what followed. The silence, the shift, the feeling that something important between us had cracked. I didn't have words for it then. I just knew that something between my father and me had changed, and I didn't know how to get it back. After that wrong choice, nothing in our house looked different. The walls were the same, the routines stayed intact, dinner still happened at the same time. But the feeling had changed. And feelings don't need announcements. They settle in quietly and rearrange everything. I noticed it first in small moments, the kind you wouldn't think to mention but that add up when you're living inside them. My father stopped asking follow-up questions. He stopped checking in. He stopped noticing the little things. Before, he would ask how my day went and actually wait for the answer. He would listen, sometimes comment, sometimes tease me lightly. Now the questions were surface level, if they came at all. How was school? Fine. And that was enough. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I told myself I was being sensitive, that I was overthinking everything because I felt guilty. But then I noticed how careful I'd become. I measured my words before speaking. I replayed conversations in my head before they happened. I avoided bringing things up unless I was absolutely sure they wouldn't cause tension. That wasn't normal for me. Before, I had been open, curious, willing to explain myself, even when I messed up. I believed that if something went wrong, we would talk it through. Now, talking felt risky, because talking could lead to distance, and distance felt worse than punishment. I didn't stop making mistakes. Kids don't suddenly become perfect because of one consequence. But when I did mess up, I hid it better. I learned how to manage impressions instead of behavior. If I forgot something, I fixed it quietly. If I struggled, I didn't ask for help. If I felt confused, I figured it out alone. Not because I wanted independence, because I didn't want to trigger that silence again. The strangest part was that my father probably thought things were going well. From the outside, I looked more responsible, more obedient, more mature. I followed rules, I didn't talk back, I didn't push boundaries, but inside, trust had been replaced with fear. I no longer believed that honesty would lead to understanding. I believed it would lead to withdrawal. That belief shaped how I related to him in ways I didn't fully understand at the time. I stopped sharing my thoughts. I stopped joking freely. I stopped being myself around him. Our conversations became functional. Logistics, schedules, expectations. There was no conflict, but there was no closeness either. And that hurt in a quieter, more confusing way. Because when someone is openly angry with you, you know where you stand. When someone is distant, you're left guessing. I found myself watching him more closely than ever, studying his tone, noticing his expressions, trying to predict his mood before I spoke. I adjusted myself accordingly. If he seemed tired, I stayed quiet. If he seemed neutral, I didn't push. If he seemed relaxed, I still held back, just in case. That constant monitoring was exhausting, but it felt necessary, because I had learned that one wrong choice could change everything. The hardest part was that I didn't feel like I could talk to anyone about it. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. There was no yelling, no obvious conflict, no ongoing punishment anyone could point to. So what was I supposed to say? He doesn't hit me, he doesn't yell, he's just not there. That's not something people take seriously. So I stayed quiet. And that quiet started to shape how I saw myself. I began questioning my worth in ways I hadn't before. I wondered if I was difficult to love, if I had crossed some invisible line, if closeness was something I had to earn back slowly, carefully. I didn't know how to earn it, so I tried being perfect. I did what I was told before being asked. I stayed out of trouble. I tried to be helpful without being noticeable. I thought if I proved myself long enough, the distance would disappear. But relationships don't heal that way. Distance doesn't dissolve just because you behave better. It dissolves when there's repair. And there was none. No conversation about what had happened, no explanation of expectations, no reassurance that the relationship itself was still safe. So the distance stayed. And over time, it started to feel normal. That's how these things work. What begins as confusion slowly turns into a new baseline. I learned to live with the space between us. I learned to expect less. I learned not to need too much. And in doing so, I lost something important. I lost the belief that relationships could survive mistakes. That belief is fragile. Once it cracks, everything feels conditional. I remember one specific moment that made this clear to me. A few weeks after the incident, I came home excited about something small, a project I had done well on, a compliment from a teacher. I started talking, energy in my voice. My father listened briefly, nodded once, and then changed the subject. Not unkindly, just uninterested. I stopped talking mid-sentence. Not because I was embarrassed, because I suddenly felt exposed. I learned something in that moment. Success didn't bring closeness back either. That was devastating, because if doing something wrong could push him away and doing something right couldn't bring him closer, what was the point of trying? That question sat quietly in the back of my mind. I didn't act out, I didn't rebel, I didn't get angry, I adjusted. I became smaller in the relationship. That adjustment wasn't dramatic, it was subtle. It happened in tiny choices, what I shared, how much I spoke, when I asked for help. But over time, those choices changed how we related to each other. We weren't enemies, we weren't close, we were careful. And careful relationships don't build trust, they build distance. I didn't realize it then, but that wrong choice had taught me a lesson far more powerful than the one my father intended. It taught me that connection was fragile, that closeness could be taken away, that silence was a form of control. And once I learned that, I carried it with me, not just in my relationship with my father, but in how I related to everyone, friends, teachers, authority figures. I learned to give people what they wanted before they asked. I learned to avoid conflict at all costs. I learned to disappear emotionally when things felt uncertain, because disappearing felt safer than being pushed away. By the time my father eventually relaxed, by the time things returned to something resembling normal, I had already changed. I didn't fully trust that closeness would last, and that mistrust became the real consequence of that one wrong choice. Not the punishment, not the rule, but the shift in how I learned to relate. By the time I reached my teenage years, the distance between my father and me had settled into something permanent. Not dramatic, not hostile, just there. Like furniture you stop noticing but still have to move around every day. I didn't think about that one wrong choice anymore. I rarely replayed the punishment itself. What stayed with me wasn't the memory of what happened. It was the way I had changed afterward. I was quieter. Not shy in the traditional sense. I could talk to people, I could joke with friends, I could function. But around my father, I became someone else. More careful, more filtered, more controlled. Teenage years are supposed to be messy. You test ideas, you question rules, you say things you don't fully mean just to see what happens. I didn't do that. I learned early that saying the wrong thing could cost me something I didn't know how to get back. So I stayed inside the lines. At school, teachers described me as mature, responsible, easy to manage. Parents told my father he was lucky. He nodded when they said it. I wondered what they would say if they knew how much effort it took to be that version of me. I didn't ask questions in class unless I was sure of the answer. Being wrong felt dangerous, even in places where it didn't matter. When teachers corrected me, my chest tightened automatically, like my body was bracing for something that never came. I didn't understand why at first. I just knew I hated the feeling. At home, conversations with my father stayed shallow. We talked about schedules, expectations, tasks. We didn't talk about thoughts, fears, or anything that required vulnerability. And I stopped trying. Not because I didn't want closeness, but because I didn't trust it. I learned how to exist without being fully seen. That skill became useful. Friends trusted me because I listened more than I spoke. Adults liked me because I didn't cause trouble. Authority figures appreciated that I followed rules without complaint. From the outside, I looked balanced. Inside, I felt disconnected. Because hiding yourself is a form of survival, but it's also a form of loss. I didn't notice how much I was hiding until I started pulling away from everyone else, too. When friends argued, I became the peacemaker. When someone was upset, I assumed it was my fault. When conflict appeared, I withdrew emotionally. Not because I was afraid of people, because I was afraid of distance. I had learned that closeness could disappear quietly. So I managed relationships carefully. I avoided topics that could cause tension. I kept my opinions to myself. I made sure I was agreeable, flexible, easy to be around. That way, no one would pull away. But that meant no one ever really knew me either. I remember one specific moment in high school that made this painfully clear. A teacher pulled me aside after class. She asked if everything was okay. She said I seemed stressed, that I worked too hard, that I didn't have to be perfect. I smiled and said I was fine, because I didn't know how to explain what was actually happening. How do you explain that you're not afraid of failing, you're afraid of being left? That fear wasn't logical. It didn't match my circumstances anymore, but it was real. It showed up in subtle ways. If my father seemed distracted, I assumed I had done something wrong. If he didn't respond immediately, I replayed our last conversation in my head. If he was quiet, I went quiet too. Silence had become a language I understood too well. And the hardest part was that I blamed myself for it. I told myself I was too sensitive, too dependent, too much. I didn't realize that what I was feeling was the result of a relationship that had never fully repaired after conflict. I had never been told we're okay. I had never been reassured that the relationship itself was safe. So I stayed alert. Teenage rebellion never came for me, not because I was morally superior, but because I was afraid of what rebellion might cost. I didn't sneak out. I didn't lie for fun. I didn't push boundaries just to see what would happen. The cost felt too high. Instead, I followed rules and lost something else: spontaneity, honesty, ease. I started believing that relationships were transactional. If I behaved, things stayed calm. If I performed well, I was tolerated. If I made mistakes, distance followed. That belief didn't stay contained to my father. It followed me into friendships, authority relationships, and eventually into how I treated myself. I became my own disciplinarian. If I said the wrong thing, I replayed it for hours. If I disappointed someone, I punished myself with silence. If I felt ashamed, I withdrew. I didn't need external punishment anymore. I had internalized it. The saddest part was that my father probably thought everything was fine. From his perspective, the problem had been corrected. The behavior had improved. There was no ongoing conflict. But improvement without connection isn't healing. It's compliance. And compliance looks good from the outside, while quietly erasing you from the inside. By the time I was preparing to leave home, the emotional distance between us felt normal. I didn't expect closeness anymore. I told myself we just weren't that kind of family. But deep down, I wondered what might have been different if that one wrong choice had been followed by a conversation instead of silence. If someone had explained instead of withdrawing.
if repair had happened. That question stayed with me as I stepped into adulthood, because the truth was, I didn't just learn how to follow rules, I learned how to hide parts of myself, and I didn't yet know how much that would shape everything that came next.
For a long time, I believed the story was simple. I made one wrong choice, my father punished me, I learned to be more careful. That explanation was easy. It kept everything contained. It let me believe that if I had just behaved better, things would have stayed the same. But as I grew older, that explanation stopped working. The first crack appeared when I noticed how my body reacted to situations that had nothing to do with my father. A delayed reply to a text, a neutral email from a supervisor, a friend canceling plans. My chest tightened instantly. My thoughts raced. I searched for what I might have done wrong. That reaction didn't make sense anymore. I wasn't a child. No one was punishing me. Nothing bad had actually happened. So why did it feel like it had? I didn't have an answer right away, but the question stayed with me. In my early 20s, I took a psychology class almost by accident. I needed a general requirement, nothing more. I wasn't looking for insight or healing. But one lecture stopped me cold. The professor talked about emotional withdrawal as a form of discipline, about how some parents don't yell or explode, but instead go quiet. How children often experience that quiet not as calm, but as rejection. He said something I wrote down immediately. Children don't fear consequences. They fear losing connection. That sentence unlocked something I had been carrying for years. Suddenly, the silence after my punishment made sense in a way it never had before. It wasn't just a cooling off period. It wasn't just disappointment. It was withdrawal. And withdrawal is powerful. I started replaying my memories differently. Not just that one incident, but many others I had brushed aside. Times when my father shut down during uncomfortable conversations. Times when he went quiet instead of explaining. Times when distance replaced discussion. I realized something uncomfortable. Silence wasn't something he used once. It was something he relied on. That realization changed the story entirely. The punishment wasn't the center of the moment. The silence was. And the silence wasn't really about my behavior. It was about his discomfort. My wrong choice had challenged his sense of control. My explanation required emotional engagement. My mistake had created a situation he didn't know how to handle. So he did what felt safest to him. He withdrew. That wasn't something I wanted to accept at first. It felt disloyal. It felt like I was blaming him. But understanding isn't the same as blaming. And as I sat with this new perspective, something shifted inside me. I stopped asking, why did I mess up? And started asking, why couldn't he stay? That question opened the door to grief. Not anger, not resentment. Grief. I grieved the conversations we never had, the reassurance I needed but didn't receive, the sense of safety that never fully returned. I grieved the version of our relationship that might have existed if repair had been possible. And that grief hurt, but it also brought clarity. Because once I saw that the silence wasn't a calculated punishment designed to teach me, I could stop treating it as proof that I was unworthy. It wasn't about my worth. It was about his limits. I began to see my father as a person shaped by his own history, his own upbringing, his own ideas about discipline and authority. He had grown up in a household where emotions weren't discussed, where obedience mattered more than understanding, where silence was seen as control, not harm. In that context, his response made sense. That didn't make it harmless, but it made it understandable. And understanding did something important for me. It took the weight off my shoulders. For years, I had carried the belief that I had permanently damaged our relationship, that one wrong choice had revealed something flawed about me.
Now I could see that the relationship changed not because I was unlovable, but because it lacked repair. No one ever said, "We're okay." No one explained expectations. No one bridged the gap that silence created. So the gap stayed. And gaps don't close on their own. They become patterns. I started noticing how much of my adult behavior was built around avoiding those gaps, avoiding distance, avoiding disappointment, avoiding moments where someone might pull away. I saw how often I still treated silence as danger. And once I noticed it, I could finally interrupt it. Not perfectly, not all at once, but consciously. When someone didn't respond right away, I paused instead of panicking. When I made a mistake, I reminded myself that connection didn't automatically disappear. When I felt shame rising, I questioned whether it belonged to the present or the past. That awareness was new and powerful. I didn't need to confront my father to gain it. I didn't need an apology. I didn't need him to change. I needed to understand what had actually happened. And what had happened was this. A child made one wrong choice, a parent responded with the tools he had, and silence filled the space where repair should have been. That silence taught me to fear distance, but now I could choose something else. Understanding didn't erase the past, but it changed how I carried it. I stopped seeing that moment as the day I broke something. I started seeing it as the day I learned the wrong lesson. And wrong lessons can be unlearned. That realization marked the beginning of something new. Not forgiveness, not forgetting. Choice. The choice to stay present when things feel uncomfortable. The choice to talk instead of withdraw. The choice to repair instead of disappear. That choice would matter more than I realized at the time, because it would shape how I built relationships moving forward, and eventually, how I became a parent myself.
For a long time, I believed healing would come from a moment, a conversation where everything would finally be said, an apology that would explain the silence, a realization on his part that would undo the distance between us. But healing didn't come like that. It came quietly, the moment I stopped waiting for the past to change and started choosing how much control it would have over my present. Once I understood that the silence wasn't really about my wrong choice, I began noticing how often I still responded to life the same way my father had responded to me. When things felt uncomfortable, I withdrew. When I made mistakes, I went quiet. When I felt unsure, I disappeared emotionally. I wasn't being punished anymore. I was continuing the punishment myself. That realization was uncomfortable, but it was also freeing because it meant I wasn't broken, I was patterned, and patterns can be changed. Slowly, deliberately, I started practicing something that felt unfamiliar. Staying present when I messed up, staying in conversations when my instinct was to shut down, staying connected when silence felt safer. The first time I tried this, it felt wrong in my body. I had made a mistake at work, nothing serious, just a misjudgment. My old response would have been to apologize excessively and then pull back, waiting to see if distance followed. Instead, I acknowledged it calmly, corrected it, and didn't punish myself afterward. Nothing bad happened. No one withdrew. No connection disappeared. No silence arrived to teach me a lesson. That moment taught me something my childhood never had. Mistakes don't have to cost you relationships. I began testing this truth in other areas of my life. When I felt misunderstood, I explained instead of retreating. When I felt hurt, I named it instead of swallowing it. When I needed reassurance, I allowed myself to ask for it. Each time I did, the outcome was different from what I expected. People stayed. Not everyone responded perfectly. Not every conversation was easy, but connection didn't vanish. And that slowly rewired something inside me. I also had to relearn my relationship with silence itself. For years, silence had meant danger. It had meant distance. It had meant punishment. I learned to separate silence from withdrawal. Silence chosen together is rest. Silence used to control is harm. That distinction changed everything. I stopped filling quiet moments with anxiety. I stopped assuming neutral behavior meant rejection. I stopped scanning for signs that I was about to be pushed away. Peace began to feel possible. The most unexpected turning point came when I became a parent. I didn't expect old memories to resurface the way they did, but the first time my child made a mistake, a small one, barely worth noticing, I felt that old reflex rise up inside me. Correct, control, withdraw. I recognized it instantly, and for the first time I had a choice. I thought about that moment from my childhood, the one wrong choice, the punishment, the silence that followed, and I knew exactly what I didn't want to repeat. So I stayed. I knelt down instead of towering over them. I explained instead of withdrawing. I corrected behavior without removing connection. That didn't mean there were no consequences. It didn't mean rules didn't matter. It meant discipline came with presence. And the difference was immediate. My child didn't shut down. They didn't shrink. They didn't look afraid. They listened. They asked questions. They learned. That moment, everything clicked. The real damage in my childhood hadn't come from discipline. It had come from the absence of repair. No conversation afterward, no reassurance that we were still okay, no bridge back to connection. So I made repair my priority. When I got frustrated, I explained why. When I made mistakes as a parent, I apologized. When my child struggled, I stayed with them. In doing that, I wasn't just changing the future, I was healing the past. Every time I stayed present with my child, I stayed present with the younger version of myself who had been left alone with his thoughts, wondering what had changed and whether it could ever go back. I didn't need my father to change for this healing to happen. Understanding his limits was enough. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't heartless. He was limited. And once I stopped expecting him to give what he didn't know how to give, the silence between us lost its power. It became just silence, not punishment, not judgment, just quiet. Today, when I think about that one wrong choice, I don't feel the same weight in my chest. I see it clearly now. A child made a mistake. A parent responded with the tools he had, and silence filled the space where repair should have been. That silence shaped me, but it didn't define me. If you're listening to this and parts of it feel familiar, I want you to hear something clearly. You weren't difficult. You weren't broken. You weren't unworthy of patience. You adapted to an environment where connection felt fragile. That adaptation helped you survive, but you don't have to live there forever. You can unlearn withdrawal. You can choose presence. You can stay with yourself and with others, even when things feel uncomfortable. One wrong choice changed my relationship with my father, but understanding that moment changed my relationship with myself. And that has made all the difference.